Sago, and welcome to this integrative journey with New Testament Foundations and NEWT Institute. I chose to integrate my learnings from the program with our lectures, studies, readings, and our assignments, as well as our discussions with my experiences and position as parent coordinator at Aboriginal Head Start. Aboriginal Head Start is an intergenerational family wellness program that serves Indigenous families with children from age 3 up until the first grade, about 6 years of age, and it's funded by Health Canada. What's unique about our program is that we have a heavy parent involvement component, and it recognizes the huge contribution that parents make towards their children's education and how they can contribute to their success in a really great way when they're involved and allowed to control part of their education and allowed input and involvement in our programs and our planning. It's a very exciting time, and if you'll come with me, you'll find yourself at the front entrance to the Aboriginal Head Start program, which is on the grounds of the Fort Erie Native Friendship Centre in Fort Erie, Ontario. If you notice above the doors, we have a representation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy wampum belt, which signifies the creation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the culture of the majority of the people that we have here in the Niagara region, in this particular area. As you walk through the front doors, you walk into a world of language, culture, traditional knowledge, and storytelling that has been denied historically to the Indigenous peoples of Canada through the process of colonization, residential schools, with the purpose of assimilating the peoples and the cultures. And we are in the process now of restoring these things. And it's a very exciting time in Canada to be a part of the reconciliation process. And as education has opened those doors, they've also made way for the church. And I'm looking for opportunities there to share the gospel news, the gospel message with people at Aboriginal Head Start. Duvall and Hay's metaphor in their book, Journey into God's Word, really caught my attention. It illustrates the river of differences between the biblical world and today's context. This concept can be used to build relationships with individuals at our local friendship center. The land, which is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and is directly adjacent to Haldimand Treaty territory. This bridge metaphor caught my attention because it talks about bridging the difference between the biblical world and today's context. And also it can be used to bridge the gap that's been created, that damaged the gospel message to the Indigenous peoples because of the involvement of the church in the residential school system and in the removal of their culture and languages. So as I began to plan to prepare for this journey, I looked back at the beginning of our semester and remembered a lecture that we were treated to by Zanny Zacharias, The Interpretive Journey, our first week. In it, he shared some guiding principles for interpreting biblical text. And one of those was for our interpretation of any biblical text to be valid, it must be consistent with the historical, cultural context of that text. Obviously, that is the same for social, political, and other methods that we use to look at context. So the reason that was important is because there is a historical, cultural issue that exists right now in Canada between the church and its Indigenous peoples that needs to be overcome. And so understanding that historical, cultural context is also important in modern times. So that's how that was blended together. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is a wonderful opportunity for churches who are interested to read these findings and find ways to open doors and to begin the process of reconciliation with the peoples, Indigenous peoples of Canada. Something that we learned early on in Hubbard's book, History of Christianity, the impact strategy was, he chose Paul's impact strategy that we found in 1 Corinthians 9:22, in which he says, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And so from that I learned, I surmised that this includes understanding the historical cultural context, all of these other social political issues that are happening with people, and learning to interpret the scriptures and contextualize the scriptures for those times and places is very important to make it relevant to the people who are listening. And so that leads me to Hubbard's background as foreground. Again, I did not mention his book properly. I'd like to cite the title, Christianity in the Greco-Roman World. I beg your pardon, that's the title of Hubbard's book. In his background as foreground introduction, section 1, he discusses the importance of understanding the historical and social context of the New Testament writings for one to understand and experience them more completely. He also cautions the reader to distinguish between the fluid, unformed, and somewhat improvisational Jesus movement of the first century and the institutional forms of Christianity in Christendom. I think that's very important in my position right now, because I do believe that the unformed and somewhat improvisational Jesus movement of the first century would appear more attractive to the indigenous peoples than what they have seen from the institution of Christendom. And so this understanding is integral in discovering how this message applies in our postmodern context and others. And so, again, mentioning the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they have 94 calls to action that provide an invitation for churches to respond. And some of the things that I noticed also, the communities in the diaspora and connections to indigenous experiences. Hubbard's use of fictional narrative in the opening of the first section draws the reader into the political, historical, economic, social, and religious realities of the ancient Mediterranean world of the New Testament. In the first century, Hubbard writes, more Jews lived outside of Palestine than inside the traditional homeland. But these communities in the diaspora were centered around houses of worship, and they promoted piety through adherence to traditional practices. They were set apart and identified as Jews through observance of the Sabbath, through male circumcision and dietary restrictions. They were especially distinguished by their worship of the one God of Israel. And now, with the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe traditional beliefs, include the belief in a creator or a great spirit who sent his daughter, who was a sky woman, into the lower world, where Turtle Island, or North America, was created by the sacrifice of several animals. They also recognize a peacemaker who was sent by the creator to teach the people Kari Wio, or good mind. Together with Ionawatha, or Hiawatha, they taught the law of peace. The chiefs of each Haudenosaunee nation joined in the Great League of Peace, forming the Confederacy, which is the only government with a direct line to the Creator, which I thought was an interesting correlation to the Jewish connection to God as Creator. So Hubbard cites Paul's letters as the historian's primary sources for understanding how the movement spread, and he names history as witness to Paul's primary role in the explosion of Christianity during his lifetime and across time. So that's why it was important that I chose Paul's impact strategy, because he had such a good one and time-tested. The world into which Paul brought the Gospels was rife with superstition. Both Gentiles and Jews believed in and feared the supernatural beings of the spiritual universe. Gentiles believed in a multitude of vindictive gods who needed to be appeased in order to avoid punishment or to preserve the worshippers' well-being. Superstition also existed among Jews at the time. The monarchy had been eliminated, their sovereignty had been removed, and the hopeful expectations of the prophets had been destroyed. The general belief was the combined efforts of Satan and his minions and the Gentiles were focused on the destruction of the seed of Abraham. And so indigenous beliefs are diverse, but they include a belief in the spirit world as well as a great spirit. Haudenosaunee belief particularly believes in a good spirit who created many good things, and his brother, the evil spirit, who works to undo it. The good spirit banishes the evil spirit to a cave under the earth after he defeats him in a battle, and the evil spirit's wicked servants roam the earth doing his bidding. Each man has both spirits, and no man is perfect. And upon death, the good spirit controls the spirit of the good man, and the evil spirit that of the evil man. So there is a definite delineation between good and evil, and there's room there to share respectfully about the Bible's take on good and evil. Also, we see that the Jewish people were in a position at this time of the New Testament where their monarchy had been eliminated. They didn't have agency or self-government type of thing, which is what the position that the Indigenous peoples in Canada have been asking for. They've been asking for nation-to-nation treatment. They've been asking for agency and self-determination for quite some time. So we're in a similar sort of position historically that we can see the window opening there for room to share the gospel in a sensitive way. Again, sensitive to those issues with Christendom. In the New Testament context, every level of social interaction was affected by the philosophical conflict between paganism and Christianity. The Judeo-Christian worldview would have been revolutionary in the world of magic, divination, and skepticism that existed as part of this superstitious ideology. Hubbard calls Paul a visionary, not only for his experience with visions, but because of his discernment in their retelling and in his general impact strategy, again, found, according to Hubbard, in 1 Corinthians 9:22. And again it says, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And so throughout, Paul taught how God, through Christ, counters the spiritual elements that existed in the cultural milieu of the New Testament with gospel truths, that with the power of the Holy Spirit, man can learn to prioritize the internal or spiritual over the external or flesh. And that was Paul's contribution to the sharing of the gospel, and again, an eye-opening way for me personally to sensitively share the power of the Holy Spirit and his way of prioritizing the spiritual over the flesh. We have Christianity exploded, according to Hubbard, due to God's presence in it. Social and political factors set the scene for the propagation of faith and spreading the gospel message as well. And so some of those things were, we've had the Pax Romana, which was a unified language. Roads and safety, they proved crucial, basically, for the rise of the movement. Despite all the attempts at suppression, they could travel freely here and there from one end of the empire to the other to share the word. They had organizational efficiency. Paul had a wonderful strategy of growth. He used the existing institutions like synagogues and places of public discourse, private homes, and volunteer leaders. They had evangelistic entrepreneurs. They were pioneers who risked their life, livelihood, and reputation to share the good news. Paul often worked outside as a tent maker or leather worker as he shared the good news as a way to sustain himself so that he could share the message. They had a caring community which was distinct to Christianity at the time, but this is similar to what is shared by the Indigenous peoples. The kinship language and familial ethos is something that can be shared between these two cultures and used as a way to familiarize ourselves with one another. Embodied virtue, that God exemplified the ethic that he embodied, that he wanted to see, and that he embodied through Christ the virtues that he expected of his followers. And so it was not a distant God who just commands things. It is a relational God, and that's the example that we can hold forth to any other culture about what God has done. Hubbard also takes the reader through a series of questions at the end of in the epilogue. Leads one to reflect on the social and political factors that set the scene for the propagation of faith and the spreading of the gospel message. He asked things like, what was the appeal of the Christian message to the individual? And asking, what needs did it meet then that it can meet today. And Hubbard reminds the reader that there are certain kinds of environments in which religious beliefs can flourish. And so, again, we just went through all of those factors that are in our current context. And so, even though we have all those factors where the gospel can flourish, we have a society today where the message of the gospel has been damaged by the church's role in the participation of the colonization and with the government's establishment of the residential schools, with the church. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made 94 calls to action, 4 of which are inviting the church in particular to respond. Number 58 calls for an apology from the Pope for the Roman Catholic Church's role in residential schools. 59 calls for all church parties involved in the settlement agreement to teach their congregation about their church's role in colonization and why apologies are necessary. And these are things that we can do in our individual congregations to help them understand why we are doing what it is that we're doing. 60 calls for seminaries to teach respect for indigenous spirituality, the history and legacy of the residential schools, and the role of the church in that system, and the legacy and the history of the religious conflict in indigenous families and communities, and to mitigate those conflicts and to prevent spiritual violence. And in my position as parent coordinator at Aboriginal Head Start, I have a firsthand view of some of these effects that are happening in families and the efforts that their community is putting in to regain footage as far as language growth and cultural development and education, and things like high school completion are affected by adding cultural and traditional knowledge to Indigenous education in Canada, as is being proven. And so it's wonderful to be a part of that and to be invited to join in this. Number 61 calls for funding for community-controlled healing and reconciliation projects, culture and language revitalization, education and relationship-building projects, regional dialogues for Indigenous spiritual leaders and youth to discuss Indigenous spirituality, self-determination, and reconciliation. And being able to bring these messages and show the church's involvement and individuals like myself involvement in programs that are furthering the Indigenous people's development in Canada is a wonderful way to open a door to start conversation for reconciliation amongst people today. So, building the bridges. James West, who is a Southern Cheyenne, suggests that an alternate paradigm for Christian mission based on the need for healing and reconciliation is a key issue involved in relating Native religious experiences to the Christian theological world. The imagery of Christ as revealed in Isaiah 61 to Christ revealing himself in Luke 4:18 is a reminder to the church. And when he's represented there as a healer and a lifter up of the oppressed and one who is reconciling things together, is a wonderful image of Christ to present and to heal hearts that are broken. The humiliation, and eventual ascension of Christ in Philippians 2:5-11 as a model for the church to follow as we lay our lives down for each other and for our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are in need of healing and reconciliation. So Paul, like Jesus, went to the synagogues to speak, to reach the Jews, and then to places of public discourse. And these are like our friendship centers in Canada. In 2020, Ontario Indigenous Peoples work for healing and teaching and friendship centers, offering many good opportunities to come alongside the good work. And they invite the outside community as well, the non-Indigenous community, to participate in these centers. So there's open doors for discourse and spiritual reconciliation and participation in this journey to reveal Christ to Indigenous peoples. It's a wonderful experience and a wonderful opportunity, and experiencing this course has enabled me to develop this understanding and to integrate these knowledges together to enable me to provide a broader experience of Christianity to the people in my context. Thank you very much for your attention. Niawen, and have a wonderful day. Oh my goodness. Before I go, I would like to take us one step further. I forgot I did this part, I beg your pardon. Creating relationships for reconciliation is when we are working with commonalities. That's where Paul's impact strategy becomes ours. We set an example of worship to the Creator, where Jonathan Miracle of Broken Walls is a musician of the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. He writes lyrics like, Jesus Ganarankwa, Jesus is good medicine, using language the listener will be comfortable relating to spiritual wellness. And there's a little link down there that you can click on that will take you to a YouTube video that will play the song for you. Understanding the historical, cultural, social, and political experiences of the Indigenous peoples in Canada positions one to discover strengths and resources as well as needs and areas that require support and calling others to action. Songs like Rise Up, Mighty Warrior by Broken Walls is a call to Christians to let the warrior spirit of Jesus rise up within them and to take their position in God's army. He presents Christ-like qualities as those of a warrior from a position of strength. In this worship song, he describes Jesus as the very one who died and gave us reason to live, to give love to those who've mistreated us and a heart to forgive. And again, there's a link at the bottom to play a song. And our final thoughts is Canada right now is experiencing the 5th anniversary of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Report was established by court order to investigate and document the history and impacts of more than a century of forced residential schooling for Indigenous children in Canada. As a country, we learned of the hardships and abuses endured by Indigenous children and the lasting harm caused to their families, languages, cultures, and communities. Churches and Christians have the opportunity to walk with our Indigenous peoples on this part of the journey, through humbly lifting up the name of Christ as the one who reconciles all things to himself. Through laying down his own privilege and taking that humble role, he is now honored by the Father. He has gone on before, preparing a place for those who do the same in his name. And thank you, Nyawen. Have a wonderful day.